So we are here because I read some columns by Mr. Crovitz in the Wall Street Journal that were quite interesting on the topic of internet governance in general, and some inside baseball about ICANN and the transfer of control in specific. And we struck up a bit of a conversation and thought it might be nice to have an informal conversation right now about these topics. And we thought the best way to start might be a little bit to each say how we came to these topics, what brought us into this zone, and then a little bit just sort of an overview, and then let the conversation evolve from there. And if you're watching through YouTube, you have an opportunity to enter comments into a chat box that we might even have a chance to see. And as we do this, we will be sorting out various tech, especially audio issues as we go. So please be patient with us. And with that, I think I'm going to try to turn it over to Gordon. Gordon, feel free to introduce yourself, and we'll see if we can get the various mics and such up and running.
Oh, Gordon, I think you have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. You click down.
I should do it.
All right, yes, we hear you now.
Thank you. I was getting a lot of echo before. I'm sorry. Thank you, Jonathan, for organizing this. I've been looking forward to it. The issue of internet governance is a great one, a fun one that's going to be with us for some time. I thought I would set the stage a little bit for my own interest in this topic by going back well before the internet to my own early experience with the multilateral system of governance as it relates to freedom of expression. Going back to the early 1980s when I was a young journalist at the Wall Street Journal, and at that time, to me, the similar issue at that time was a UN agency called UNESCO was doing its best to create what it called a New World Information Order, which was basically a system to use the UN to legitimize censorship and suppression of free speech, obviously in the pre-internet era, but during the Cold War and during a time when governments were very aggressive in trying to legitimize censorship, a time that I think in some ways is similar to today. In any case, as a journalist reporting UNESCO, I had a fantastic story. I wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal, and the day before, a congressman from New York, a Democrat from New York, was coming to Paris to investigate some of what I had reported. There was a mysterious fire at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. All the files were disappeared. Shortly thereafter, the US, Britain, and Singapore all left UNESCO for some time. But that is why I am focused in part on this issue, and in part because of the miracle of the permissionless, largely unregulated internet that we have all come to know and love. And the question I think before us is, are there risks now to the internet that did not exist before the Obama administration's decision to make an adjustment to the governance of ICANN and IANA, which we'll talk about today.
Wonderful. I've unmuted my microphone. You may need to remute yours depending on how the sound turns out. And that's a very helpful introduction to hear. I guess for my part, I came to this when I was a teenager. I used my parents' credit card to sign on to the CompuServe information service, which was one of the pay by the minute or by the hour services. CompuServe run by H&R Block on their mainframes when they weren't crunching tax return information, and found a whole world opened up through that 300 baud modem, text only of course. And after about 6 weeks the bills came in. My parents told me I had to sign off, and I sent my apologies to the CompuServe forum for TI-99 computers that I was participating in, and I got back an offer to be an assistant sysop, or system operator, in exchange for free time.
Nice.
And over the course of several years from there, was a sysop in several forums. A shout out to any former sysops out there today. And over the course of those years, they actually kept track of the billing if I were to have been billed, and I ran up over $250,000 and that was when money still meant something, in connect fees over that time. And it was from there that I saw the internet really take over. And at the time, we thought it was going to be CompuServe versus the source versus Prodigy, who would win, and out of left field came the internet, in part because, as Gordon was describing, it had this sort of permissionless innovation. Over the course of those years, they actually wasn't billing by the minute, and that worked out wonderfully for the world and for the internet, not so well for CompuServe. I became fascinated by internet governance, and in particular in ICANN domain names and that sort of thing. As I was teaching on these issues, I taught a class at Harvard, one of the first classes I ever taught in 1997, in which one David Clark, who teaches at MIT, came over as a guest and described the way that the domain name system is managed, and it was so jaw-dropping how informal it seemed. I couldn't believe it worked, and neither could the students. And it was around that time that the informal ways were being supplanted by much more formal ones, and I and the Berkman Center actually had a very modest role in being around as ICANN was coming together. I confess I ended up with perhaps a bit of a hangover on internet governance issues within a few years of going to meeting after meeting around the world, arguing about the proper governance of what ICANN does, and at some point I realized ICANN does domain names, and the internet is so much more than that, that actually what ICANN is doing may not bear as much on the digital future of anybody watching this podcast, whether individually or as part of a company, that it wasn't clear to me it mattered all that much. Whether Google chooses to list you on a search for bicycles if you're a bicycle shop is far more important to you than whether you get bikeshop.bicycles or not, or under what circumstances you might pay to renew the domain name. So that was sort of the place I came from, and it's just very interesting. I should pass it back to you, Gordon, but I think we agree on a lot, including on the kind of world we want to see online, and maybe just happen to have a real different view on how much ICANN matters, and therefore how much this backstop by which the U.S. is perceived to ultimately bear responsibility for ICANN, how much that backstop matters. Back over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I am grateful as a user of the internet for all the ICANN meetings you endured. From everybody I've known who has gone to them, they do seem a wee bit tedious.
I'll never get those hours back.
The analogy that I might try out on you and see what you think about this is, if you're an admiral in the U.S. Navy and you're watching U.S. naval ships protect the open ocean for free trade, to keep those networks open, the networks of trade open. During peacetime, it's also quite boring, and nothing happens, and that's good. And the analogy to ICANN, I think, is with the role that the U.S. has had, light and benign as it has been a bit like the U.S. Navy protecting the international sea lanes. And the risk to that happy world is what happens if the U.S. Navy is not protecting sea lanes. Or to extend the analogy, the Commerce Department does not have ultimate veto authority over ICANN, and maybe more importantly, the root zone and the naming of the domains and the websites and the addresses, and keeping that directory honest and accurate and non-political. So I completely understand the people who say the role of ICANN has been kind of clerical and passive, and I think that's true. But what I would say to that is, we've had a multi-stakeholder management of the internet where engineers and developers and network operators and the entrepreneurs who, of course, have built the internet have been able to operate largely freely in terms of the global internet. Different countries, of course, as we know, have had a different point of view toward their domestic internet. We happen to be speaking on June 4th. The Chinese devote an enormous amount of resources to closing off their internet. People don't know in China, many of them, the history of Tiananmen Square, for example. That, I think, is largely because the internet has been apolitical because of the U.S. role in making sure that it has been apolitical. So there are hypotheticals that, I think are at the very least worth discussing, that I think are very hard to defend against without the U.S. having the kind of role that it currently has. So the alternative to the U.S. role, to me, is not that all governments get out of a role of the internet. Instead, it's that all governments, not just the U.S. government, will have some role, some greater role. They'll join the multi-stakeholders. And there are, within the rules of ICANN, there are ways that governments, if they want to, can adjust the existing rules to give a majority of countries authority over ICANN and the root zone that I think we would all find highly troubling, and would, for the first time, give countries like China and Russia the opportunity to affect the internet outside their own countries, including for those of us in the U.S. used to being able to go to freeukraine.org or remembertiananmensquare.org. And those are the kinds of issues that I think that I'm concerned about. It's the reason I've been writing about this issue. And I don't think the Commerce Department or the management of ICANN or anybody else yet has answers to the questions of what if certain countries, focus on using the inherent powers and authority within ICANN and the naming authority to extend censorship and suppress the freedom that we've had on the internet.
Got it. Well, that helps us maybe focus the conversation a little bit, and I should say I've studied internet censorship for quite a while. In 2000, co-authored the first study of internet censorship in China, in particular what websites were blocked and which weren't. Followed up quickly with Saudi Arabia. Turns out the thing in common, like the very first thing you're going to filter if you're an authoritarian regime looking to filter something, is a Baptist church. Baptist churches have their websites taken off as the first line of attack. I guess I'd like to unpack a little bit more, because I found myself doing this as I moved from somebody, I think very much holding the kind of views you've just expressed 15 years ago, to somebody not seeing this as a problem, in fact seeing the most recent move of the Commerce Department getting out of this as a very useful thing, to the extent that it matters at all. And it is, let's unspool the worst case scenario here. You've kind of hinted at it. It would be that Russia or China, or name your sort of regime that doesn't embrace free speech or the rule of law, manages to quash the domain name of a particular website by having taken control of ICANN. But that maybe is what you're suggesting. I should let you fill that in a little bit more, and then I'll take a crack at explaining, from my point of view, how plausible or not I think that is and why.
Great. So first, let's establish that a majority of governments in the world, if they could censor the global internet, certainly would. We had
yes, the way they would put it is, if they could make it conform to their local law, the way that they get to say how cigarettes are labeled, even if those are shipped from North Carolina, why shouldn't they get to say how the bits are shaped? That, you're right, would be the argument of many governments, of course, including our own, when it comes to the speech or behavior expressed in bits that our own government doesn't like, such as gambling.
Right. So we saw a couple of years ago the meeting of the International Telecommunications Union, a vote taken, 89 to 55, essentially to split the global internet into one where the majority of those countries would be the beneficiary of a treaty that was created by the ITU at that meeting, that in effect legitimized domestic internet censorship in a way that those countries, Russia, China, Iran, many others that you well know and have written about, where they looked for the legitimacy for their censorship that a UN agency can bring. So let's say, for argument's sake, that there are roughly 90 countries in the world that are in favor of that sort of thing, roughly 50 around the world that are not. So the idea of any kind of majority vote and government control, I think we would both agree would be troubling. So there are scenarios under which the rather ornate, maybe even Byzantine rules of ICANN can be manipulated by governments focused on doing that to give first governments much more control over ICANN than they have previously had. One of those would be to move from a consensus view among the subgroup within ICANN that is of governments.
Yes. I think the word you were looking for on the procedures of ICANN is baroque. They're very baroque, the procedures.
But absolutely baroque.
I'll share why it really doesn't concern me in the hierarchy of many, many things to be concerned about the health and openness and freedom of the Internet. First, we should note that ICANN is, as much as it tries to express itself as an international, consensus-based, etc. organization for very understandable purposes, it is a California nonprofit. It's a 501c3 governed under the laws of the state of California, and nobody's talking about changing that.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on, Google Hangout. That actually is one of the questions that came up in congressional testimony. And I think the head of ICANN's answer was he has no plans to shift from California. I've spoken to him about it. I don't think he does have plans to shift from California. But he immediately said, but of course I'm not really in charge of ICANN. If I try to change the kind of coffee being served in the cafeteria, I get a lot of pushback from the multi-stakeholder community. So
yeah, absolutely. So, but I agree with what his testimony appears to have been, that there's been no push for that, but he is not a dictator. It is community-oriented, which means that it's actually hard to get anything done, such as change the coffee in the cafeteria, which means a change as drastic as that would probably be quite hard to put through. And to put it through, it would require action by the board. It has a board of trustees, which is decidedly not governmental. There's a governmental advisory committee, which was a way of trying to get the governments to have a place, because they all had their designated liaisons to the Internet and decided that ICANN was kind of the best manifestation, the tangible manifestation of the operating Internet that they could find. And those liaisons needed a place to confer and thank the kind gentleman from whatever country for that wonderful statement. And that's what this advisory committee does. But this is just sort of one of 2 points I wanted to make. The first is, as a matter of sort of corporate nonprofit governance, there are already some pretty decent things in place. I'd be hard-pressed to think of what more could be in place, even hypothetically, that prevent any great transformation of ICANN as suddenly coming under the heel of X number of governments that want to control it. But there's a second point that maybe is a little more fundamental, which is, let us suppose that somehow name your bad entity for these purposes, government X that really wants censorship, basically, maybe like the FIFA soccer scandal, just writes a big check to the ICANN president. I should just be clear, this is entirely hypothetical. This is not suggesting this is happening. That says if you and the rest of the board will buy off the whole board too. You and the board will all vote the way like buying off a ref for a soccer game. What's the worst they can do? And it turns out the worst they can do, through a fairly genius and quiet way of which this is all organized, is next to nothing. If, for example, I wanted to make sure that freetibet.org went away, if I control ICANN, the only way to do that is to threaten the registry that runs .org. That happens to be something called the Public Interest Registry, itself a separate nonprofit incorporated in the United States. It, in turn, is kind of a wholly owned subsidiary of the Internet Society, on whose board I served, and I see Khaled Kuba has put in a comment on our side screen. Khaled was a fellow board member of The Internet Society, although he now appears to be at an ITU meeting, Colette, if it's a hostage situation, just let us know through the chat window. But you would have to threaten .org with being entirely delisted from this file you mentioned called the root file, so that when people try to visit any .org, not just Free Tibet, they couldn't go anywhere. That is such a crude tool, it would be truly beyond conception of ICANN attempting to use it. And even if it did, suppose it actually tried to pull the plug and take .org out of the root zone, at that point, Internet service providers around the world who consult the root zone voluntarily for information about where to find .org names, if they get back an answer that says, I got nothing, I forgot where all the .orgs are, they would, by just a special tweak in their own respective files, keep happily consulting the public interest registry for the .orgs. It turns out, and maybe this is the case in many organizations where if you run the organization, you're more aware of your powerlessness than your power. It's actually really hard for me to game out in the chess how even Vladimir Putin running ICANN could actually get rid of freetibet.org in this kind of censorship sort of way that we're talking about.
Well, as you know, there is the word Baroque, I think, is quite apt for this as well. There's a Baroque structure of who controls the registries, etc. I am not saying that it would be a simple matter to make a dramatic shift in the open nature of the Internet, but it is a conceivable matter. And in exchange for what? So, you know, Bill Clinton, during his administration, the concept of a multi-stakeholder Internet was invented, has come out against the transfer, citing the enthusiasm of other governments to find ways to undermine the open Internet. What benefit is there to the Internet or to free speech or to some of the American values that have been spread through the Internet to countries that don't have them, to making this change? If it's not broke, I don't know why we're trying to fix it.
Yes, and in that sense, I have no inside knowledge, but I suspect that the sleepy hallways of the Department of Commerce were not expecting their announcement of this planned, quote, transfer of control, or really a lapsing of a cooperative agreement with ICANN, to have any of the pushback, the reaction that it has had. I guess I should note that I remember back in 1998, when all of this was getting started, there was a real sensitivity to, wait a minute, is this just U.S. imperialism? Is the U.S. still going to be somehow trying to run the Internet through ICANN? And the proper, appropriate answer, especially to get it off the ground, given that there was potential chaos looming and the Department of Commerce had stepped in with almost zero legal authority in particular to do it, was trying to kind of herd all the cats along, and the answer was, look, we're going to be in the mix to make sure this thing gets up and running and that there's confidence in it. It's basically a confidence-building measure, and then fly, little bird, fly. You will be a community stakeholder-driven organization. And the judgment was, okay, it's ready to fly. There's in fact not a whole lot the Commerce Department could really do if it were mortified at the way ICANN were conducting its affairs, in part because it had very little original authority under any statute. Where does the Department of Commerce get the authority to have regulated it all? And the answer, I think, is nowhere. The original framework for creating ICANN was called the White Paper, and it was published in the Federal Register as a statement of policy. It was not a regulatory thing at all. So it was really just to say, this is now what's the actual plus? All optics. It's all optics. And in some ways, I think you and I are just having a different take on what are the optics. That for Commerce to announce with a press release that, okay, bird has grown up, it's left the nest, have fun, ICANN, I think you were reading that as a signal to the adversaries of a free and open internet that it's open season. Let the hunting begin of this vulnerable ICANN. And to me, I think it indicates something quite different, which is a vote of confidence in ICANN so that some of the alternative schemes of governance that have been tried at times that would bear some of the characteristics that worry you, including much more heavy-handed government involvement, this is a way of saying to those in the middle trying to figure out which path to take, who don't want any government, including the U.S., and maybe these days especially the U.S., to have a thumb on the scale, to be able to more comfortably support ICANN.
I think your history of the creation of ICANN and the point of view in 1998 is entirely accurate. I think there was sort of an intent over time to find some new governance for it. What I would say, however, is that a lot has changed in the world since 1998. The enormous resources of countries like China and Russia, the understanding that authoritarian regimes have of the potential threat to their legitimacy of various parts of the internet, social media, and others has grown exponentially since then. And we have, through the ITU and through ICANN itself, recently, some evidence of the enthusiasm that some of those authoritarian governments have to look for ways to muck up the open internet that we both would like to protect. So I think you are right that I am quite concerned that when one looks at the importance of closing the internet, censoring the internet, undermining the open internet to a large number of authoritarian governments around the world, including some with very sophisticated technical tools and diplomatic and financial, and I'm not going to use the word bribery tools, but bribery has been known to happen elsewhere, that over time those pressures can only grow and can only become more of a danger. And I see very little to no benefit to a change in the current system. When Congress pushed back after the announcement by the Commerce Department, Congress asked for a couple of things. It asked for a copy of the legal opinion that the Commerce Department says that it has done, that says that the Commerce Department can give up the authority over ICANN without congressional action.
For which you realize, by the way, my view on that is it never had any authority to give up to begin with. But anyway, go ahead.
But I think just as the U.S. government can't transfer land in the West to somebody without congressional action, the Constitution is pretty clear that things having to do with commerce have to go through Congress. And I think the last time this came up in 2000, the Commerce Department said it would have to be heavily lawyered to determine. And there are, as I think there's legislation that's passed the House that says no transfer of ICANN without congressional approval. Hasn't passed both houses, I want to be clear.
Yes.
But it's a real issue reflecting concern about the downside, potential downside of this shift. And I would say more broadly, less legally, more politically, if there are so few risks and if there is some benefit to doing this, let's have an open debate about it. Let Congress vote on it. That's the way our politics are supposed to work, rather than the executive branch unilaterally making a decision that obviously has the potential to affect an enormous amount of commerce, as we all know the internet represents. So if we have an open debate about it, if the people who are running ICANN can come up with bulletproof ways to protect the open internet, then that would be a different scenario. But right now, the Commerce Department, when it made its announcement, tasked ICANN with coming up with some way to keep these bad scenarios from happening. The leadership of ICANN is very focused on this. I know you're a former trustee, I think, of the Internet Society. The Internet Society listserv on ICANN governance it reads a little bit like computer scientists trying to become political theorists. It's a little bit like watching political theorists try to write code. It's very complicated and difficult And I don't know of any institution in the history of the world that has managed to be a multi-stakeholder organization and run the way the internet is run without becoming a multilateral, that is government-led, operational organization. And that I think is my concern, which I think is shared widely. But I do agree with you that I think one of our major points of difference is that I see very little to no benefit of the U.S. giving up this control. It's not as if there'll be no government control. That might be more appealing. It's that there's going to be control by a lot of governments, many of which have values quite different from ours.
Yes, I think it's really a question of how much of this is control and ownership. And when we use metaphors of as if giving up federal parkland or something for another purpose, that's actual territory that you either own or you kind of don't. And when you think of control, you think of one of the more florid metaphors was this is like Jimmy Carter giving back the Panama Canal, which, not to start another conversation, it doesn't appear to have gone horribly awry as best I can tell. But control over the canal would mean, well, who gets to say what ships shall pass through it? And in this case, I don't think we're talking about ownership like of a piece of land. You and I both celebrate the unowned nature of the internet. And I don't think we're talking about control of the sort that is a blockage that could in turn express censorship. The closest we see from that in ICANN is its implementation of only in some domains like .com and .org, a global trademark dispute resolution policy if some entity has McDonald's.com and it's not McDonald's, the hamburger people, they can do a summary proceeding. And there are all sorts of issues maybe with that. But I've seen no movement to extend beyond the dispute over the domain name to a dispute over that to which the domain name points. And more, domain names don't matter nearly as much, again, as something like the search engine. And of course, quite properly, none of us is talking about how to govern search engines in some common multi-stakeholder way. We all get to debate over what the top hit for governance should be, and it's not between some multi-stakeholder group or governments that will decide. In that case, it's one or two private companies. I mean, the market share for Google in Europe, as we know from the Right to Forget debate, something like 93%. And I mean, that's a canal, not run by Panama, but run by Google, that has far more impact on the world as far as shaping the information people experience than, again, these sort of very, to me, implausible situations in which domain names could be affected. So I think what sounds maybe to you like naivete on my part, I think that if the U.S. Removes its exceptional role on paper with ICANN, it's nuts to think that that vacuum won't be filled by other states. I guess by my lights, it's not even a vacuum. There's not a lot of power being expressed there, and the optics of it, what otherwise looks like a surrender or a retreat, in fact are quite positive and healthy optics to keep the multi-stakeholder model, that's what we've got right now, up and running and rolling, rather than imagining somehow that the governments are going to be able, under law or fact, to come in and do something. So I see one person in our comments tree, I'm just looking at the most recent one, asked, what does the summary proceeding process for trademark issues involve? Does ICANN possess a way to enforce the ruling afterwards, or does it delegate to other organizations? The quick answer to that, and you can look this up, Molly, it's the Uniform Dispute Resolution Process, the UDRP, and the enforcement happens really at the registry level. The entity that runs .org or .com will have agreed with ICANN that it will respect the principles of this procedure, and then somebody who doesn't like the way a domain name is assigned has to pay some money to fund the proceeding, They can do it all over sort of email. It doesn't have to show up anywhere. And whoever has the domain name assigned, who is being challenged, has to come back with something, or if they fail to, that might not look so good. And there are a number of dispute resolution providers. Oddly enough, they get to be selected by the plaintiff-ish character. You can see I'm not that fond of the UDRP in some ways. And then if the UDRP results in a win for the challenger, the registry can just reassign the name, and that takes care of that. So it's one of the few areas of internet governance where the judgments can be self-enforcing because the dispute is solely over a piece of virtual property, rather than say, somebody stole my money, I want it back. Now you got to go find the money somewhere. It's not in the realm of the digital. Gordon, I should throw it back over to you.
You just gave a fantastic answer to a fairly detailed question. So let me just come back to what is otherwise a narrow question of whether the contract relating to ICANN and the naming authority is property and control, and therefore requires congressional action. This is not debated by many people. You can go to the rest of YouTube, and you probably will not see two people debating this issue.
No, you'll see two cats debating it.
You very well may. You are right. The federal land analogy is a real property analogy. The better analogy is a contract to run traffic control at a government airport, to run a souvenir stand at a national park, and those have to be delegated authorities from Congress to the executive branch or an agency in order for the executive branch to be able to do that, and there's been no such delegated authority.
So I'd say, to that I'd say close but not quite in my view, and the way to understand my thinking on it is I remember back in 1997, there had been, back in the real sands of time, the National Science Foundation wrote checks to smart engineers to experiment with networking, and the experiment turned out to be the internet. And some would say the jury is still out, the experiment is running. And the checks were to fund their research and to help the hard costs, that kind of thing. And as best I can tell, the total U.S. government investment through these means in developing the internet is less than Yahoo got in its initial IPO back in the late 90s. I mean, it's kind of very good investment for what we got on a return as a kind of public around the world on this. And one of the agreements, again, run through the National Science Foundation, was to fund just the ministerial recording of who had what name, in particular in something like .com. Back in the day, before this happened, you didn't even have to pay to register .com. You could have as many as you wanted, and they were free. It was just assumed that nobody would want a whole bunch of them because isn't one enough for you? And this is how, back in the day, you could have journalist Joshua Quittner register McDonald's.com before it even occurred to the multinational hamburger company that they might want it. I mean, it was a weird time. Okay, so you end up with the company called Network Solutions that had won the bid to do this ministerial registration paid for by the government. They had a genius entrepreneurial idea, which was, instead of the government really paying us to do it, why don't we collect the fees to maintain this database from the users registering the names, and the government doesn't have to pay us anything. The government said, okay, great, we won't pay you any more money, and there was a cooperative agreement for the Network Solutions to charge $70 for a 2-year rental of a name. Great idea to have it be rented, not owned. And after that, $35 a year to keep renting this name as if it were something that, like, they had to hose down every so often or dust off or who knows what. I mean, most of the money that went to Network Solutions was to fund the infrastructure to know when to send you the bill and to chase you if you didn't pay it. So it was kind of one of these circular things. And this was a 5-year agreement started in 1992. So the question was, as we near the end of 1997, what if the agreement expires and we haven't figured out yet what's going to be the new system? And the real wedge that the Commerce Department had to even get into this was on this agreement with Network Solutions expiring. And I was part of those. I wonder what will happen. This could be a crisis. The internet could shut down the day after the contract expires. But then I realized, you know what? It is a little bit like municipal garbage collection, where step one is your taxes pay for the city garbage truck to come along every week. Then step two, like in some more rural areas, there's no city garbage collection. Your taxes don't pay for that. Sorry. Instead, you pay directly to the garbage collection firm. And in fact, Network Solutions said, you know what, if the contract expires, no biggie. We'll just keep doing what we're doing gratis, which is to say, charging people $35 a year for their names. And nothing would have changed, in fact, if the contract had expired. So this gets back to your observation about the nature of the contract. To me, the thing that ICANN is doing, which is to say, entering into arrangements with registries by which the root file will point to those registries to say where .org answers can be found to questions like where is ISOC.org, what they're doing was not something the U.S. government itself ever did, is not something that if I were to start doing it tomorrow myself, anybody would prevent me from doing. And that's why, to me, it's nothing that requires any sort of real scrutiny by the government to figure out who's allowed to do it. The answer is anyone's allowed to do it. It just so happens that ICANN does it, and everybody pays attention to them because of the fidelity with which it's been doing its job, and the fact that if you listen to ICANN's answers to the question of where is .org, you'll find the .org sites you're looking for.
I predict before we get to the end of this issue, whenever that is, when the current ICANN contract expires in 2015, or as the Commerce Department more recently has said, it could be kept going for another 4 years, and now we're at 2019 and a new president and maybe a different point of view. We'll have to see. I do predict that this interesting legal issue will end up getting aired in some detail. The difference between the early innocent days that you, I'm sure, quite accurately described, and today is that ICANN is now hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The contract with ICANN, if it were not to go to ICANN, is meaningful in an economic way. The registries, of course, are become quite.
But if I just should say, if that contract evaporated tomorrow, if some judge somehow decided that things hadn't been signed properly, and in fact the contract was dead letter, ICANN would be worth and have that ridiculously large income flow that it has. It would still have it. Nothing would change because by that contract, no meaningful thing is being given to ICANN that it doesn't already have except legitimacy. And in 2014, it does turn out as an optical matter, legitimacy is now conferred by favoring no government rather than by being perceived as sheltered under the U.S. government for reasons, of course, we both and everybody watching probably know.
I think two small points. One, the contract is worth a lot to ICANN. If ICANN didn't have it renewed, it would be economically significant, which would be the legal issue before separation of powers, lawyers, and whatever court it would end up in. I think it's a real issue, and without getting into the minutia of Washington politics, when I first began reporting on this question, I asked the Commerce Department for its legal opinion, saying that it had the authority unilaterally to give up the contract. And the Commerce Department says they do have such a legal agreement, but they haven't shared it. Congress has now asked for it. Congress is doing its own.
Yes.
It's a whole new stream of work for lawyers that I know we're all grateful to have happen.
Well, of course, asking the executive branch for its legal opinions, no matter how modest the topic, is probably right now and always a somewhat sensitive issue.
Absolutely, and under our separation of powers system, it should be. But I think this is going to be a good issue to be resolved. And all I would say about governments is, I think we don't have the choice of the involvement of zero governments. If there were a way to have the internet operate with zero government involvement, that would be, to me, quite different. I think our choice is either the benign, light, defensive, that is protective, stewardship of the U.S. that we've had since the beginning of the internet, or the involvement of all other governments with an outcome that I think is hard to predict, except in one way, which is the internet will not become more open. The pressures will be for it to become more closed.
Now, I know we should probably wrap up, so I can't help but want to end on a separate sort of provocation, which is this great stewardship of the government, and in particular the U.S. government, that I know you're counting upon and rely upon. I'm just trying to predict how much of that stewardship you'd like to see in the provision of network services. And isn't it good stewardship of the government to have those net neutrality rules?
That's an excellent provocation, Jonathan. I think you and I are on different sides of what some call the net neutrality argument, which I call the government regulation argument.
See, now the government stewardship, I'm sorry, regulation is terrible.
Absolutely, Jonathan, and you and I are on kind of different sides of this issue. I think we probably have more in common in terms of the way we would like the internet to operate. I do come back to my first point, which is that in the history of the world, when governments get involved in something like information and freedom of expression, that tends to lead to bad outcomes. The United States is, of course, imperfect, but it's been a great steward of the internet so far. And I come back to, if it ain't broke, let's not fix it.
Well, maybe this can be to be continued, and we can pick up on the net neutrality front or one of many other topics. Of course, my meta kind of thought is to the extent that those listening out there do have energies or curiosity about the future of the internet and wanting to study it, I guess my thought, and this is indeed where we, I think, continue to differ, is the action is happening generally not anywhere near ICANN. It's happening on issues and debates around net neutrality, issues and debates around things like the right to forget, which in turn is the thin edge of the wedge about control over the shape of the information we see, over the more that we move away from search engines that then present us options and we pick one, and more to a Siri-like model where we're just being advised by a digital concierge about what we want. Many subtle ways that can influence how we understand and perceive the world, and nearly all of that is undeniably in private hands right now. And it's the kind of thing that I think, Gordon, may puzzle or be an interesting challenge for you to work through, because it will end up, if there is to be a change in it, or if we have worries about it, these would be interventions into private firms rather than into this sort of more inchoate internet space. I see in our comment stream, one of our commenters says, "This isn't the kind of debate I'm used to. It's actually pleasant." And I agree with that, and I think that's a good reason to consider possibly another chapter. And Gordon, I just want to thank you for being game to pick this up, as we had, not intentionally, but very different and somewhat dueling columns on this, yours in the Wall Street Journal, mine in the New Republic. But I hope we'll have a chance to take it up on other topics.
I look forward to it, Jonathan. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Okay, farewell to those listening, and to posterity, since I believe this will be archived as well.